There's a line up across and there's no return. There's a time and a place, no bridges left to burn. The innocents were laying when in the end you failed to save them. To a happy ending, then it turns out life was far less like possible odds. That's when you learn you've been messing with God. Sending a dream to crash, and we cannot when all you see is all you need. Right now the world just a childish dream. We decide our worlds. The story won't be told. And victory is inevitable.
Episode 7 rolls around and we get the first day of classes, though things do not go pleasantly for Team RWBY. The first order of the day is rearranging the group's new dorm to suit the group's taste, though only RWBY seems excited to do it. Yang wants to be excited, but was out celebrating late into the night and is thus tired and hungover. Blake is attempting enthusiasm, but lack of normal social interaction has left her awkward and hesitant. And Weiss is decidedly uninterested, since she'd normally have servants to do that sort of work for her. RWBY struggles to get them involved, with all talk of team building going in one ear and out the other. However, she manages to cajole them into doing the work since they'll need to do it eventually, and that gets the other three girls moving with a weak "Bonsai." In a comedic manner, they rearrange the room with no small amount of conflict, often squabbling over what is defined as personal space or over RWBY shearing the curtain in two with her scythe. Eventually, the room is finished, just in time for them to realize they're late to their first class. The quartet rush out the door, followed quickly by Team Juniper, who are dorming right across the hall. This is where we get a montage of some of the different classes they're attending for the semester, as well as a hefty chunk of diegetic exposition. Both Yang and RWBY sleep through hunter regulation and law, but we learn no small amount of information about the role of huntsmen in society. Huntsmen in Vale operate in a legal space between mercenary and law enforcement, with their training focused primarily on fighting Grimm either in the wilderness or as town and city guards. They can be brought in as emergency guards and relief workers during Grimm horde attacks on outlier villages. They can also be contracted out privately and publicly, serving as police or military attachés or even straight up mercenaries for hire, giving the career a great amount of versatility. Transferring over to sparring and team building, we learn that huntsmen can operate in a number of different configurations, from lone wolves to organized platoons and echelons, most of which is dependent on the job at hand. One of the focuses of the class will be helping students discover their semblance, a superhuman ability relatively unique to each person, as well as how to better utilize it in combat and in tandem with other huntsmen. It's during this particular talk that RWBY begins to space out, and after being hissed at by Weiss, RWBY waves her off. Their entire team already unlocked and know their semblances, why does she have to listen to any of this? It's also here that we learn that huntsmen, in order to combat the malicious nature of Grimm, are sometimes required to fight criminals in order to mitigate social unrest, a fact that excites Yang but disinterests Blake. We learn why they might need to do so in Grimm's studies, where RWBY and Yang spend much of their time doodling. The Grimm are monsters of unknown origin, even to modern science, but it is known that they are intrinsically attracted to negative emotions. The closer in proximity they are to negative emotions, the easier they can locate a target. While a group of people won't inherently attract the Grimm just by being together, a number of people experiencing emotional tumult simultaneously can intensify this signal to Grimm, attracting more and more to the population. Oftentimes, a Grimm attack leads to a self-fulfilling loop of fear and panic that attracts more Grimm, eventually resulting in a massacre. This is why huntsmen must be trained to take care of the townsfolk and defend them at all cost, using whatever they have at hand. This is where we cut to the last main class, Dust Application. Here we quickly establish the basics of dust. It's the go-to propellant in Remnant, operating like the setting's equivalent to oil, petroleum, and coal. In addition to this, we learn that it's a highly effective weapon, utilized as firearm propellant with different effects, manipulated in its raw form with the user's aura, and can even be infused directly into the user's body, though at great personal risk to themselves. It's in this class that Weiss's patience with her teammates reaches its breaking point. Through the whole montage of classes, we've seen Weiss reacting with exacerbation at the team's shenanigans, and in particular, RWBY's. Here, RWBY tries to be funny, doing an impression of one of their professors, Peter Port, by mimicking his facial hair with dust crystals. Surprisingly, for a brief moment, she manages to get Weiss to chuckle. Unfortunately, Weiss chuckling causes her to tip a potent vial of dust off the lab table, resulting in the whole lab being blown up with a concussive blast. Shocked, dirty, and with her ears still ringing, Weiss shakes, growls, and shouts RWBY's name. RWBY says, oops, and we swipe cut to Osmond's office. We open up on the team being reprimanded by Glinda for their poor behavior and for blowing up the dust lab on only their first day. Ozpin calms Glinda and notes to the girls that the intention of the randomized partner and team selection process was to force individual hunters to learn how to work with and against their own faults, not only as combatants but also as people. Learning to cooperate and work together is one of the greatest assets humanity has in the face of the Grim, and while hunting alone is typical procedure, the ability to work together with other people is absolutely vital to a huntsman's toolset. Considering this is only their first day, it's possible that this is just a simple mishap, so he's willing to forego severe punishment such as suspension or expulsion. But recognizing problem students when he sees them, he has decided to assign them some guidance, a team 1 year their senior to help them work out the kinks in their team dynamic, who they'll meet the following day after classes. In addition, they're assigned some community service in order to account for the damages to the school. Weiss offers to pay, of course, but Osmond chuckles and says that he has no concern for the money involved. More so, he's concerned with the health of Team RWBY's attitude. As the team shuffles out the door, RWBY lingers in his office, deflated by Weiss's attitude towards the situation. She expresses to Osmond that she doesn't feel like she's up to leading them, and asks Oz if he made a mistake choosing her to be leader. He replies, "That remains to be seen," prompting RWBY to ask what he means. Osmond looks at her knowingly and says, "It's only been 1 day. RWBY, I've made more mistakes than any man, woman, and child on this planet, but at this moment, I would not consider your appointment to leader to be one of them." He leans in so he can look more directly at RWBY, smiling warmly. "Do you? Give it time, Miss Rose." This puts her worries at bay, and she leaves. Osmond watches her go, his face nonplussed. He takes a sip from his mug, and we cut to black. Episode 8 opens the next day, with the four discussing what happened over lunch. Weiss is particularly vocal about the incident, raising issue with every member of the team, especially RWBY. Yang and RWBY defend themselves, but even though RWBY sticks up for Yang and her lackadaisical nature, Yang is slow to defend RWBY, showing some apparent apprehension with her sister as a leader. Blake is quiet, except for a brief moment where she notices a rabbit faunus named Velvet at another table being bullied by Cardin, flicking her ears and accidentally spilling her lunch tray, leaving the girl clearly distressed. Blake clenches her fist and snarls, but Weiss brings her back to the conversation, finally addressing her issues with Blake, which, compared to RWBY and Yang, are minor at worst. Blake shakes her head and leaves the table, ending the conversation. The next scene introduces us to the team's older siblings for the school year, Team Coffee. Coco Adele makes a very defined, aggressive entrance in the same vein as a drill sergeant. She praises our protagonist, introducing herself and her team, all while keeping the drill sergeant act the whole way through. She explains Coffee is there to kick Team RWBY into shape and get them functioning like a proper unit, saying that Osmond has given her the power to discipline them if they don't listen. Weiss, utterly confused, objects, resulting in Coco ordering her to do push-ups. Weiss is about to object again when Coco sweeps her feet out from under her with little effort. Stunned and cowed, Weiss attempts to do push-ups. Fox leans in and whispers to Coco that he didn't quite think that this is what Ozpin had in mind. Yatsuhashi corrects that Ozpin didn't give them any power to punish their sibling team, and Velvet asks if any of that was actually in the pamphlet. Coco surreptitiously stuffs a pamphlet that was sticking out of her purse even deeper in, saying, "Fine, fine, sorry for messing with you guys." She turns to the struggling Weiss and says, "But you still need to give me at least one push-up." Coco then defers to Fox, who suggests that the 8 of them split off into pairs in order for Coffee to get a feel for each person's individual issues. He explains that anything they want to talk about is privileged knowledge, and that the school will expel any member of Team Coffee that talks about anything discussed between sibling pairs. RWBY of course splits off with Coco, Weiss goes with Fox, Blake with Velvet, and Yang with Yatsuhashi. From here we cut to each conversation and gain insights on the characters involved. Starting with RWBY and Coco, the two go to Coffee's dorm room, where Coco uses fashion to frame RWBY's issues. Coco, though a bit dry, is good-natured and jokes with RWBY, which eases the mood. Coco directs the conversation to RWBY's approach as a leader, and RWBY explains that she hasn't given it too much thought. She doesn't want to be Miss Bossy Pants all the time. When they're not on a mission, she'd rather be their friend. She'll give commands and stuff when they're out in the field, but she wants her teammates to have fun more than anything. Coco chastises her, explaining that being a leader is a round-the-clock duty. Wanting to have fun and be a kind-hearted goof is all well and good, but RWBY needs to keep in mind that she's constantly wearing the team leader hat, and thus any outfit she wears, any action she takes, needs to match that hat, no matter the circumstances. We jump to Yang and Yatsuhashi, who are at the school's gym, where Yatsu meditates and talks while Yang does pull-ups. Yang is far more open about her issues and is actually quite thankful to have someone to talk to about them. She expresses her unease with her sister, both as a teammate and as a leader. She's proud of RWBY, but also wants her sister to stop depending on her so much. She also admits that she needs RWBY to be strong, because she's afraid that one day she'll leave RWBY all alone without anyone to back her up. Just like... Yang shuts up after that, but this will be the first hints we as an audience get to Yang's underlying issues with her mother, Raven, a plot thread that'll be explored much later in the series. This conversation gives us an insight not only into Yang's fears of becoming like her own mother, but also acknowledging that despite that fear, she may very well abandon RWBY anyway. Yatsuhashi doesn't utter a peep during this, as Yang uses him more as a sounding board for her issues. It's only after touching on her own faults that he raises some questions, challenging Yang to reflect on her behavior towards her sister and the rest of the team. People, not just a good leader, need someone to rely on and keep them moving forward. By fearing some eventuality that may never come, all she has done is set a self-fulfilling prophecy in motion, one that will distance her from her sister and her teammates. Yang is hesitantly receptive to the analysis, saying that it'll probably help with RWBY, but remarks that Blake is a different story since she's already pretty distant from the rest of the team. Yatsu says that partners need to trust each other as well, but bonds like that aren't built in a day. He elaborates that she and Blake will bond so long as she's there to support her partner when she needs it. Weiss is a much different story than the others. She and Fox sit down at a bench overlooking Vale from Beacon's cliff face, with Fox trying to open a dialogue by way of asking her what her problems are. Instead, Weiss reiterates a condensed version of her gripes with each teammate. RWBY is too stupid, Yang is too lazy, and Blake is too quiet. She tops it off with how, if she were in charge, she'd have them all whipped into shape by now. Fox attempts to speak again, only for Weiss to cut him off, saying he couldn't possibly understand since he isn't a leader. The conversation ends with them both awkwardly sitting in silence. Blake and Velvet are the last two shown in the episode. Velvet takes Blake through Beacon's gardens, tending to a few of the flowers as she goes. After some small chit-chat, Blake finally asks how Velvet does it, why she puts up with being bullied by Cardin when she's a year older. Velvet is somewhat embarrassed that one of her juniors saw that, but explains that Cardin may be a bully, but an eye for an eye would make the whole world blind. Hurting him would only make him more resentful of the Faunus. That doesn't mean she'll put herself into the position to be bullied. She knows her limits. Even if it's painful, she can deal with him. She'll try to figure out a way to maybe befriend him so he'll stop bullying people altogether. She'd much rather gain friends than enemies anyway, and just looks at Cardin as an extra challenge in that regard. Blake listens and reacts to this with a frown, but says very little, shrugging off Velvet asking if she has any problems to get off her chest about her teammates. At sunset, the 8 reconvene before the two teams go their separate ways, with Team RWBY leaving the courtyard. Coco remarks that RWBY's young and inexperienced, but she picked up on what Coco said very quickly. Yatsu remarked that Yang equally had a good head on her shoulders, while Velvet was delighted with the conversation with Blake, even if Blake didn't open up at all. Fox, meanwhile, laments that Weiss just kept shutting down the conversation. She talks a lot, not much listening going on. Coco pats his shoulder, saying that with what she saw of RWBY, she has faith that Weiss's icy shell will melt someday. The episode fades to black, looking at the sunset. Episode 9 begins with Team RWBY and Vale doing community service, with RWBY, Yang, and Blake complaining that 2 weeks of punishment for one screw-up is too harsh. They're all elated that this is their last day of it. Velvet is there to supervise them as they clean up after a small festival, with her remarking this will be nothing compared to the cleanup needed after the Vital Festival in a few months. RWBY is using her semblance to create an airstream that sucks all of the trash into readied cans held by Yang and Blake, and Yang compliments her on using her semblance so creatively. She also helps Blake out when she's struggling to hold down her own can against the windy blasts. Out of all of Team RWBY, Weiss is the only one not doing any of the work, finding cleaning up garbage to be below her station. RWBY, putting on her leader hat, tries to chew her out for it, but falters in her confidence. Yang backs RWBY up, noting that it would go quicker and easier if Weiss helped Blake. Weiss is not too receptive to the idea, Rolling her eyes and crossing her arms, she kicks a can into a sewer grate and turns to the girls to say, "See? I'm helping." Velvet steps in and suggests that Weiss help some of the other workers take down the stands instead, since it'll be cleaner. Weiss reluctantly complies, since the whole team could get in trouble otherwise. A few of the workers are excited to work with a Schnee and openly call for her to join them, noting that they'd be better company than a critter like Velvet. Velvet frowns at the epithet, and Blake flinches angrily. Velvet shares a look with Blake, shaking her head that it isn't worth it. Yang asks what that was all about, and Blake is quiet for a moment before she entrusts to Yang, alone, as a half-truth, that she sympathizes a lot with the Faunus, and language like that really riles her up. Yang notes the irony of being on a team with Weiss after hearing that, but otherwise commiserates with Blake, earning a small, appreciative smile. The remaining 3 members of RWBY get back to work and discover an arm sticking out of one of the trash cans after another airstream. Horrified, they scramble to pull the person out, and upon clearing the person's face, they are greeted by a cheery, "Salutations!" They pull out an odd but bubbly ginger girl, Penny Polendina, who quickly introduces herself to the team. She explains that she was curious why the area was roped off, wandered in, and was caught up in a strange localized weather event, causing RWBY to shrink in embarrassment and apologize. A brief conversation with Penny ensues before Weiss walks back over to the group, brushing herself off after some scaffolding collapsed. She snarls at the workers, calling them ruffians and klutzes worse than RWBY. She takes notice of Penny, and further introductions are made. Penny offers to help them clean and proves herself incredibly able, holding 2 bins by herself and doubling their cleanup efforts. However, in her enthusiasm to help, she accidentally covers Weiss in trash, angering the heiress and prompting RWBY to defend her new friend. Weiss, livid, says she's done for the day and goes towards the heliport. RWBY apologizes for Weiss's rudeness, and Penny says it's okay before parting ways with the team on good terms. Velvet, looking at her scroll, calls it a day and congratulates Team RWBY on finishing their community service. However, as the 4 head back to the helipad, they come across another dust shop that was robbed. The collected girls eavesdrop on the police, who theorize it was most likely the White Fang like the last 2 dust shop robberies the city has suffered. The episode ends on an ominous note as Blake looks at the storefront with concern. Episode 10 begins with Team RWBY going to sparring class, though Weiss apparently went ahead on her own without explanation. Blake thanks RWBY for giving her pointers on tuning Gamble's Shroud, and Yang thanks her for saving her ass on the first Grim Studies test. This small moment goes a ways towards showing that RWBY is already improving as a leader, a friend, and as a student. As they approach the class, we learn why Weiss went ahead. When rounding a corner, the 3 teammates discover Weiss locked in a heated discussion with Glinda. Weiss is insistent that there must be some kind of process to change teams or otherwise reassign the leader. While Weiss is adamant about getting a transfer, Glinda rebuffs her, defending Ozpin's judgment on the decision, quoting that hundreds of huntsmen have graduated from Beacon, and the only times transfers were ever permitted were if one of the teammates could not complete the year for whatever reason. Weiss pulls off to the side, curling into herself like a goblin as her imagination pops up. In her mind, she begins to plot. If that's the case, then maybe RWBY can meet an unfortunate accident with some stairs. Oh, wait, no! Does she have any allergies? Wait, I can frame her for grand larceny! Glinda asks Weiss if she's alright, startling Weiss from her thoughts. She coughs into her hand and says that she's fine. She's just disappointed that an establishment as refined as Beacon doesn't have such a simple process. Glinda glares at Weiss before looking over her head to where RWBY, Blake, and Yang are listening, saying, "Issues like this are better sorted internally, with the rest of your team." Weiss follows Glinda's look and is stunned for a moment to be caught red-handed. She coughs into her hand and tries to save face before heading into class. It doesn't work. This creates a bad atmosphere going into the class, and none of it is helped when Glinda announces that it's time for partner sparring. Weiss immediately refuses, citing RWBY as unworthy of her talents. RWBY is taken aback. She knew that Weiss didn't think much of her as a leader, but as a huntress, she'd thought that she'd more than proved herself back in the Emerald Forest. Glinda, uneasy about the tension, allows the fight, emphasizing the rules in an attempt to keep things from getting out of hand. We learn that this is a free-form match, where combatants will be tasked to reduce their opponent's aura to 25%, but otherwise there will be no restriction on weapons or equipment. All force is authorized, of course, but Glinda says that if either girl drops below 15% of their aura, the victory will be forfeit for unsportsmanlike conduct. She emphasizes this by asking the girls to please try not to kill each other. We even have some witty dialogue here with Weiss saying, "I know the rules, Professor." And Glinda responds, "Rules change when the stakes are personal, Miss Schnee. It is too bad that the rules do not stay changed when all is said and done. Now bow to your opponent and begin." RWBY bows and Weiss reluctantly curtsies, and the fight begins. Weiss immediately tries to ready her stance, but RWBY has already rushed forward, catching Weiss off guard. Using the hook of Crescent Rose, RWBY tosses Weiss into the air and barrages her with bullets. Landing on a series of glyphs, Weiss has to jump through the air to avoid RWBY's attacks, all the while firing back with ethereal dust projectiles. RWBY is forced to roll aside and Weiss drops safely to the ground, immediately pulling up a glyph shield to block RWBY's sniper fire. RWBY counters this by rushing forward, curving around the shield, but Weiss sees this coming and the two lock blades in close quarters combat. Weiss takes the advantage with her ballerina-like control, but RWBY isn't far behind with her raw speed and rapid flourishes. The two dance around each other, chipping at each other's aura before Weiss uses a gravity glyph to spring RWBY into the air. RWBY reacts quickly and hooks Weiss's leg with Crescent Rose, bringing Weiss into the air with her. The two continue to trade blows, using glyphs and speed to juggle each other before knocking each other back to opposite ends of the arena. The girls are breathing heavily, and their auras are already very low. Briefly, we cut away to the stands, where Blake and Yang and all of Juniper are watching the fight with great concern. RWBY recovers first and charges forward, straight for Weiss. Weiss counters by bringing up an ice wall that redirects RWBY into a loop-de-loop before sending her straight into a wall. RWBY is stunned and frustrated by the blow and only has a moment to breathe before Weiss peppers her with harrying fire. RWBY kicks off the wall and begins to zigzag, her speed increasing with every burst. Weiss, watching this, begins to panic, but she grits her teeth and breathes, focusing herself. Spinning in place, she calls up a glyph that catches RWBY in the middle of her zigzag and slows her, before sending out several projectiles her way. The first projectile strikes Crescent Rose, locking it in place with a binding glyph from the white trailer. Seconds later, the other projectiles hit, completely restraining RWBY in place. Sweating, Weiss then curls back, spins her rapier's dust cylinder, and charges her blade. She launches forward and strikes RWBY, breaking the glyphs and throwing RWBY to the floor. RWBY collapses as her aura hits 16%. Weiss stands, faltering for a moment from exhaustion, but ultimately holds her head high, with an aura of 26%, having barely won against RWBY. There is silence in the room as Weiss composes herself and wipes the sweat from her brow. Even having come so close to losing, Weiss only ends up seeing this match as a win, lording it over RWBY as a sign of RWBY's incompetence. All RWBY can do is glower at Weiss from the ground as Yang and Blake pick her up and dust her off. Weiss, pleased with herself, walks into the shadows of the arena, watched by a despondent Glinda. We then smoothly transition to Tortrick scrambling out of the shadows of an alley. He's injured and carrying a briefcase much like the ones carried by his goons in episode 1, all while being chased by a huntsman. Tortrick uses a good amount of guile and trickery to delay the huntsman, injuring the man significantly as he does, but ultimately he's cornered and the huntsman strikes. However, instead of dying, Tortrick surprisingly shatters into glass shards. The huntsman is allowed only a moment of confusion before he's impaled from behind by a sharp blade, killing him. Off to the side is Torchwick, watching Neo pull her blade from the man's back and screw it into her parasol. She coughs, and Torchwick is immediately at her side, guiding her towards the van. He comments all the way that while he's grateful for the save, she really should stay in bed. He needs her alive and well to pull off their biggest heist yet. As they close the van doors, the screen cuts to black, ending the episode. A special thanks goes out to all of my wonderful patrons for supporting the channel. If you like this content and want more of it, please consider supporting it. Also consider picking up my new action-adventure novel, The Artificer, which is now available for purchase on Amazon in digital and in print. With that all said, back to your regularly scheduled fixing. Episode 11 is now the official beginning of the John arc. This is a much derided arc of the original show because it steals focus away from our main protagonist and dedicates a quarter of the volume's focus on a single side character. In Fixing, however, we've spent considerably more time with Team RWBY to justify this, 90 minutes compared to the original show's 60. Technically speaking, the arc has been roughly doubled in size, from 20 minutes to 40, but this also doesn't accurately reflect the increased involvement of RWBY during its length. This effectively balances out that time down to roughly 20 minutes of focus for John across the whole 4-episode span. A few days have passed following the duel between RWBY and Weiss, which is the topic of the day between Juniper, Blake, and Yang in the dorm commons. Apparently, the relationship between Weiss and RWBY, as well as Weiss and the remainder of the team, has bottomed out, leading RWBY to drown herself in video games and Weiss to bury herself in her studies simply to avoid the others. John makes some kind of remark about the duel itself, either innocuous or sarcastic, and Yang responds by pointing out that in their partner spar, Pyrrha won in under 30 seconds. We even get to see a brief clip of the fight to demonstrate the monumental difference in skill. Pyrrha, being a kind soul and with the first inklings of a crush on John, tries to defend him, but John rebuffs everyone, claiming he was just off his A-game. Calling his bluff, Yang and Nora dare John to challenge Cardin on the next sparring day, with Nora wagering a week's worth of desserts. He accepts, wagering the last 2 X-Ray and Vav comics he got, and Pyrrha asks if that's really the wisest decision since he values his collection so much. He responds flippantly that he's not afraid. Web cut to John in the arena across from Cardin, double guessing his course of action. We see a more extensive rendition of the fight between the two, with slivers of John's tactical mind cutting through his inexperience to keep him afloat against a physically superior foe. However, it's apparent that Cardin's raw skill and strength outmatch him by miles. Summarily defeated, John goes off to tend to his injured pride. Pyrrha watches him go, and later that night she drags him off to the roof. He's confused why, when she very earnestly offers to help train him. To her surprise, he's offended by the offer. In his indignance, John says he doesn't need her help, he doesn't need anyone's help. He has to do this on his own. Pyrrha presses him on what he has to prove by going it alone. He already got into one of the most prestigious combat academies in the world. At that, John breaks and says that he didn't. He admits that in order to pursue his family name and tradition, he forged transcripts and wormed his way into Beacon. Preempting any response from Pyrrha, he defends his actions, pointing out that he's genuinely been trying to catch up, he just needs time. Pyrrha tries to say something, but John cuts her off, saying that he doesn't need her pity. He got himself into this, he'll get himself out. Pyrrha pulls back from him, clearly disheartened, and quietly says, "If that's what you want, John." Feeling unwanted, Pyrrha leaves. Now alone on the roof, John grips his head in frustration, before Cardin appears behind him, hanging off the roof's railing. Cardin hops over the rails and reveals that the emotional moment between John and Miss Perfect happened right above his room. Bringing in John with an over-the-shoulder hug, he begins to say that the two of them are going to become great friends. We fade into darkness, ending the episode. Episode 12 follows the fallout of Cardin discovering John's secret. We find John in class, absolutely exhausted, with heavy bags under his eyes. Professor Oobleck, a scraggly, hyperactive coffee addict, is giving a lecture about a Faunus revolt in Mantle following an event known as the Great War. Spurred on largely by the destruction of culture as an attempt to cancel out the emotions that attract Grimm, the revolt ended up as a global flashpoint for Faunus-human relations around the globe. Slowly, John drifts off to sleep, but a paper airplane thrown by Cardin snaps him awake, leading Professor Oobleck to call on him. He's questioned about what advantage the Faunus forces had at the Battle of Fort Castle, and he panics, looking around the room for an answer. Pyrrha tries to pantomime to him the correct answer, but he misreads it and answers, "Binoculars!" The class laughs at the wrong answer, Cardin especially, but Oobleck zooms in on him, asking if he knows the correct answer. Cardin nonchalantly says that it's easier to train an animal than it is a human, leading to Pyrrha calling out his close-mindedness. Oobleck swerves the question Pyrrha's way, and she correctly deduces that night vision was the answer, since many Faunus have near-perfect sight in the dark. Blake piggybacks on that and elaborates on the follies of the human forces in the war as well, before taking a dig at Cardin for not paying attention in class. John drops his head to the desk as his friends look at him with concern. Of course, none of his friends know what's going on, and we the audience only have an inkling of what caused the previously attentive John to suddenly be lackluster in class. It only comes to light for the audience when Cardin pulls him aside after class and casually orders John to do tomorrow's homework for all of Team Cardinal. During lunch, his friends express their concern, but he shrugs them off, heading back to the dorm to get an early jump on his obscene workload. Yang voices her concerns to Pyrrha, who is also uneasy and equally confused, but feels too polite to pry. Yang huffs in frustration that it hasn't even been a single semester and their friends group is already going through massive bouts of drama. Sick of it, she states her intent to bring all of it to an end personally, a notion that Pyrrha objects to, saying that getting involved would just further complicate the drama. Yang brushes off the assertion and tries to get Blake's solidarity on the issue, only for Blake to be distracted watching Cardin harass Velvet. Catching this, Yang and Pyrrha comment that people like Carden are trash, but there's unfortunately nothing any of them can really do about it. Nora enthusiastically suggests breaking his legs, but Yang and Pyrrha retort that it would get them suspended if not expelled. Blake, however, bites back, asking why stopping a bully would be a bad thing. To everyone's surprise, Weiss walks up to the lunch table and weighs in, commenting her own bafflement that Faunus are even allowed to attend Beacon. This comment leads to a trade of barbs between her, Blake, and later Yang, raising tensions at the table. The argument comes to an abrupt end when Ruby arrives with her own lunch. She and Weiss hold glares at each other for a few seconds before Weiss huffs and goes to find more suitable company. Ruby sits with them, though only pecks at her food, saying she heard Glinda was looking into a possible transfer. While Yang thought that news might make Ruby happy, Ruby laments that when they worked together in the forest, she'd felt a connection with Weiss, like they really could work well as partners. As much as they've been at each other's throats, Ruby got the feeling there was more to Weiss, and she was really hopeful there might be a breakthrough. Giving no one the time to respond, Ruby says she's not hungry and goes out to finish the next level in one of her games. Before she leaves, she confirms with Blake that they're going shopping the following day for the class trip to Forever Fall. The scene ends with Yang inviting Blake and the latter some of Juniper out to party since it's Friday, to take some of the edge off. All of them decline, well, Ren turns down for Nora, and Yang remarks that it's their loss. She stands from the table and meets with her friends from episode 2 to get ready for a night on the town, ending the episode. Episode 13 opens in Vale with Ruby and Blake shopping for camping supplies. Their survival class is headed to a location called Forever Fall as a practice expedition, and their team's collective grade in the class ends up dictating their budget for supplies. The purpose of the system was to emphasize the value of education and instill a sense of resourcefulness when that fails them in the field. Unfortunately, it also leaves the struggling Team RWBY quite strapped for cash. For all the stress being put on them, the two are in oddly high spirits, able to bond over a number of different book series while they shop. Blake is even surprised by some of RWBY's choices in literature, as they convey more complex themes than the normally bubbly girl initially seemed able to handle, calling back to Blake's dismissive "life isn't like a fairy tale" line. RWBY goes a bit deeper into her own musings on the subject. She loves old stories, but when she would go to look them up herself, she often found the originals and not the modern versions taught to kids. It opened her eyes to see how scary the world can be. However, she looked at how each story was pacified for younger audiences and found an underlying truth in how something fun and enjoyable can be born from something more twisted. She looks at the world as something that is plagued by monsters, and people like Huntsmen are the force that will slowly change that reality into a more fun and friendly one. Admittedly, she doesn't express herself very well. I mean, who's she going to talk about this with? Yang? Tai? But Blake learns to respect the surprising amount of maturity RWBY has. She challenges RWBY, asking if Weiss being so difficult to work with is analogous to her musings. RWBY admits that she never thought the process would be easy, and Weiss is just the first real indication of the kind of world she's going to have to learn to work with. Meanwhile, a hungover Yang is slapped awake by Coco in the coffee dorm room, who chides her for getting drunk when the rest of her team is already in disarray. As she explains, her and Velvet found the blonde asleep on the door to Team RWBY's dorm, after the two had come back in from their morning jog and they dragged her back to their own room. Yang retorts that she lost her keys, and Velvet chides her that there's a couch in the commons. Yang feebly tries to shove Coco and the rest of Team Coffee away. She groans that she just needed a break from it all. There's really nothing she can do. Getting involved would just spur on more drama, so she tried to drown her woes in booze and hoped it would all go away. Yatsuhashi's about to say something when Coco slaps her again, berating her that, sure, jumping in at the wrong moment will make things messier, but jumping in at the precise right moment can go miles towards solving the issue. Irritated bickering ensues between the two, before Yang decides to concede defeat and think over the issue. She makes her way to the door, and says she's going to see if she can convince Weiss to open the dorm for her. Back shopping, Blake and RWBY split up, only for RWBY to run into Penny, who happily joins in on the equipment hunt. Along the way they find Pyrrha, doing much the same, but who is also worriedly looking for John, who she lost while shopping downtown. We flip over to Blake, who ironically runs into John. At Carden's demand, he'd snuck away from Pyrrha in order to purchase a mysterious unmarked box. Looking at Blake and recalling her stealthy nature, paired possibly with some good comedic clips of her being sneaky around the dorms, John strikes upon a plan and pulls her aside, asking her help with something sensitive. Blake is resistant until he mentions getting back at Carden and getting him off his back. With a grudge against the bully, Blake ends the episode asking what John needs her to do. Episode 14 is the exciting conclusion to the Jaun arc, with all the teams camping in Forever Fall as a part of Professor Peach's survival course. Glinda, one of the other chaperones, explains the day's assignment of gathering sap and leaves the teams to do their work. She pulls Weiss and RWBY aside and explains that while they are making the unusual preparations to swap teams, the two are still partners for the interim and should work together as amicably as possible, for which RWBY takes the suggestion seriously. When Weiss makes a dry, insulting quip, RWBY manages to stomach it peacefully. In fact, RWBY asks Weiss to take the lead in an attempt to placate the heiress and avoid further friction. Weiss haughtily accepts the suggestion and begins doling out instructions while Blake and Yang watch. We cut to Team Cardinal, who are loafing around while John does all the work collecting their allotment of sap. However, John only comes back with enough jars for him and his own team. He has collected nothing for Team Cardinal. Cardin is, of course, livid, but John stands up to him with a shaky confidence. His confidence gives way as Cardin ignores his posturing and instructs his teammates to collect the sap jars. Grabbing John by the hoodie, Cardin drags him off to fulfill his master plan, to coat Pyrrha in sap and unleash the contents of the mystery box that John bought for Cardin. Cardin reveals the box contains rapier wasps, who are among many different animals attracted to the sap from the trees of Forever Fall, a fact Cardin learned from reading the reports John did on his behalf. Realizing this is a plan to hurt his friend, John works up the nerve and finally turns on Cardin. When Cardin extorts him to throw the first jar at Pyrrha, John instead throws it at Cardin's armor, coating him in sap instead. Enraged, Cardin and his team immediately rush to beat the crap out of John, only to be interrupted partway through when an Ursa, a bear-shaped Grim, attracted by the sap, attacks. Why is the Ursa attracted to the sap? I honestly don't know. This was a flaw in the original RWBY that flew under my radar when I first wrote this, and I failed to address it. Maybe Grimm have some semblance of the animals they represent? Maybe the sap smells like blood? Who knows? It's just a thing that Ursas are apparently attracted to, and we just gotta roll with it. All of Team Cardinal, save Cardin, scatter, leaving him and John alone to deal with the Ursa. Cardin tries to fend off the beast, only to lose his mace over the side of a cliff, leaving him unarmed for the rest of the fight. We cut over to Team RWBY, where Yang and Blake are busy gathering sap. Behind them, in the background, are RWBY and Weiss. Strangely for their dynamic, they seem to be getting along, a moment where Weiss has let her guard down and the sparks of their chemistry manage to break through the tension between them. This peaceful scene is interrupted as Russell bursts through the underbrush and falls to his knees in front of Blake. He begs Blake and her team to save Cardin, citing back to how she saved him during initiation. Blake is visibly tempted to refuse, but decides to help after she hears John screaming as well. She calls to RWBY, Weiss, Yang, and Pyrrha, who drop everything and rush to help. Nora, by this point, has passed out from eating too much sap, leaving Ren to make sure she stays safe. Arriving at the cliffside clearing, RWBY quickly assesses the situation and puts Blake, Yang, and Pyrrha on guard along its perimeter. Weiss objects, saying they can overrun the Ursa by rushing it together, but RWBY slips into full leader mode and snaps at Weiss just to do as she says. As this exchange happens, Cardin tries to brain the Ursa with one of the jars of sap. All he really succeeds in doing is covering it in goo. This, however, gives John an idea. He grabs his own jar, opens it, and uses the scent to lure the Ursa away from Cardin. RWBY very harshly explains to Weiss that she's going to knock the bear off the cliff. To do so, she needs a boost from one of Weiss's glyphs to give her kick the extra oomph. But first, she needs an opening. Both John and Pyrrha hear this, and John immediately sprints for the cliff, acting as bait. Luckily for the plan, the Ursa goes for him and gives them the opening they need. Using Weiss's glyphs, RWBY launches forward and slams into the Ursa's side, sending it hurtling over the edge. John would have been caught up in the attack, unable to dodge out of the way, if not for Pyrrha subtly using her until now unknown semblance to pull him the extra few inches out of harm's way. Yang notices Pyrrha's subtle motions and asks her what she just did. Smiling sheepishly, Pyrrha whispers that her semblance is polarity, and at Yang's confused gaze, further elaborates that she can manipulate metal. Oh, that's really attractive. Pyrrha's smile becomes unimpressed, but she puts a finger to her lips and asks Yang to keep her semblance on the down low. Yang affirms, "My lips are sealed. Magnetically." Pyrrha gives a disappointed stare before we cut away. With the rest of the team, Weiss chews RWBY out for her ludicrous plan, saying the combined teams could have just charged in there to overwhelm it. However, RWBY stands up for herself and defends her actions. It was an Ursa Major that attacked, which are primarily solo hunters. But if she were wrong and it was just a normal Ursa, then they would have had to deal with an entire pack, in which case their strongest fighters were already defending the perimeter to hold the line. In addition, since she assumed that it was a Major, she knew that none of their weapons would be able to pierce its hide, meaning the only way to deal with it would be to knock it off the cliff instead. In fact, there's a chance the Ursa isn't even dead at the bottom of the cliff. Weiss is dumbfounded by RWBY's cunning, but more infuriated at being talked down to, so she stomps off in a fit. Moving over to John, he helps Carden stand. Carden doesn't bother to even thank John for the help, but John squeezes Carden's hand painfully tight before declaring, "We're done." Carden is confused, but John finally pops the trump card he's been carrying the whole trip. He had a friend, heavily implied to be Blake, sneak in and swap out Carden's transcripts with forged replicas that John made from the originals. Effectively, this means John and Carden have the same blackmail hanging over each other's heads. If Carden tries to expose John for forgery, John can just as easily point to Carden's transcripts as forged and get them both expelled. Carden is shocked and angered at John's gall, and is left speechless as John says, in no uncertain terms, that Carden is not to mess with him or his friends ever again. Carden angrily rips his hand away and grunts in acknowledgement before stomping off. We fade in on our last scene, with John on one of the dorm's rooftops. Pyrrha walks up behind him, commenting that she was looking for him. John turns to her and apologizes for cutting her off when she tried to help. The two make amends, and Pyrrha invites John downstairs since Ren apparently made pancakes. John stops her as she goes, and after rambling about how he doesn't deserve it, asks if she's still willing to train him. In response, Pyrrha pretends to mull the idea over, walking up to John and shoving him to the ground, commenting how his form is all wrong. Pulling him to his feet, she smiles and says, "Let me show you how it's done." Cut to black, end of episode.